for coming to the Pagny Health and Research Foundation presentation, grand round presentation, bringing clarity to chaos, weathering times of great change, with our speaker, Kimberly Faith. And next slide, please. This is eligible for CMEs from the New York Medical College, and the activity sign-in code is 13NUNS, N-U-N-S. It expires tomorrow at noon. The text code to show your attendance is 828-295-1144. Or you can visit eeds.com. Kimberly Faith has no relevant financial relationships to report in the last 12 months with a commercial interest, and this activity is not commercially supported. We will show you this screen at the end of the presentation as well, and we will send this to you if you've signed in. We will send it to you after the program so that you have the code. Next slide.
There we go.
Take it away, Kim.
All right, thank you. I'm so delighted to have all of you here today. I know that you are awfully busy, and I wanted to just start right quick. I wanted to start, if you all could find your chat box, and I'd like you to just simply check in with me and let me know how you are doing in this moment on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being I've had better days, and 10 being I'm feeling pretty on top of the world today. So I'm just doing a quick check-in about where are you today, so I can have some idea of where the group is. And I have my eye on the chat box. So a scale of 1 to 10, if you'll give me a number about where you are. Okay, that works. All right, a chronic stable 5. All right, that's a good one. All right, so it's always good. I like to be able to do a check-in, and I'll actually explain to you why a little bit later. So when it comes to us having this session here together about bringing clarity to chaos, it's really what I was asked to do was actually create this particular session for people that involve their family. With so many people now having family involved, that was where the first thing came from. But for all of you, family entails something a little bit different because many of you are there at your locations. And I thank you for all that you've been doing during this time. I do want to just share with you right quick is I've had the privilege now to train or coach over 30,000 leaders. You'll see some of the industries there. I've worked with a lot of different companies, but please know that I spent a lot of time in healthcare. I've worked with healthcare systems. I've worked with local smaller healthcare groups. I'm often brought in as someone who facilitates this thing called Friday Night at the ER. It's a tool that actually teaches you about systems thinking in a healthcare perspective. So I've had a lot of conversations with people in healthcare, and I want to talk about some of those things today. But what does all of this mean? Well, what it really means is that I have a lot of conversations with people from all over the world. I've worked with people from 33 different countries and 24 industries, and I take great joy in actually having that opportunity. And so I'm honored to have you here today. So let's start off with this whole thing. I want to introduce you to this concept of systems thinking. I actually had the chance to work with Dr. Peter Senge, who was the author of the book, The Fifth Discipline, back in the 90s. And it was my first job actually out of college. I was brought in to try to teach people how to look at things in a much more holistic way. We did so much work in that particular community that we were featured in the Fifth Discipline Field Book, which came out shortly thereafter. So I've been teaching systems thinking for a long time, and what I've done though is making it relative and relatable. And I recently just published a book for women, also having to do with how this fits in for women with systems thinking and the narratives. So what does this really mean? Well, I'd like you to have your chat fingers ready again, and I want to show you an image. I want to show you an image, and I'd like you to type in, I'm going to count on the count of 3. I'd like you to type in what you see. Okay, are you ready? 1, 2, 3. What do you see on your screen? A parrot. Parrot. Colorful parrot. Okay. Making sure I've given everybody some time. I have shown this image to thousands of people, and that's typically what they will tell me. Thank you for the emoticon, Siamata. I appreciate that. That was impressive. You were able to pull one up that quickly. What most people actually see is a parrot. But what if I told you it was not a parrot? What if I told you there was something more there? Take another look. This was actually a woman painted to be like a parrot. And so this was the World Body Painting Competition in 2012, and you'll see the name of the artist from Italy that won. Now, why did our brains automatically go to a parrot? Well, it looks like a parrot, it's shaped like a parrot, it's colored like a parrot, and the very things that help us with our brain and saying that, like if we're driving home from work or walking back from somewhere, that we can talk and still get somewhere at the same time. You all know that the neuroscience of that is helpful, but sometimes it can stand in our way. And that's what I wanted to bring up here today, is that rarely are things what they appear to be at first glance. And so the very thing that works for our brain and sometimes stands in our way. And so if I showed you the picture of a parrot and everybody thought it was a parrot, it was very easy for all of us to walk out of the session all believing it's a parrot, when in fact that's not what it was. And this is really important perspective when we're talking about bringing clarity to chaos, especially under the kinds of change that we're going through right now. Now, please know that I'm going to start with this message of hope. And I believe hope is an acronym, harnessing our power every day. That's one of the fundamental things that I have learned with this discipline of systems thinking, is that we actually have more power than we think we do. So in today's time, I think it's important to begin with hope, and we will also end with hope. So what is our focus today? Well, first thing I want to bring your attention to is how you're going to see the trees through a number of these slides. And there is a reason for that. It's because what happens to all of us is that it's important for us to not only see the trees, but also see the forest. And based on where we are in our scheme of the reality of the world we live in, sometimes we lose sight. What systems thinking is all about is being able to see the tree and the forest and to dance between the two. That's another way to be able to bring clarity. So when you see this, I wanted you to understand where that came from. So I'm focusing on three things today based on where you are in your environment. Tahina and Siamata did a great job of prepping me about what's going on there in your world here today. Three things we want to focus on. One is navigating your now. The other is resilience on the rise and hope on the horizon. So I want you to think back. All right, I think back to right when COVID showed up. I'd like you to think back to that day for just a moment. I'd love you to take yourself off mute. And do you remember the week it happened, the week that things changed for you? Do you remember a line, a mark between before COVID and after COVID? I would love to hear from some of you. No volunteers? Please. Tony, did you want to comment?
March 17th, when I was pushed out of the hospital to work at home by age and by medical condition.
Okay.
I felt very torn.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm finding that most people can figure out a date. What about some of the rest of you? I'd love to hear, when was the date that things became very, very different for you? Peter, would you like to comment? Or Alan? Maybe they can't find their mute button.
I can comment actually. So I'm working in the hospital facility dental clinic. There is a Brooklyn hospital, Coney Island Hospital, and we have a dental clinic in here. And we have a pretty busy schedule. So that was Monday when I came, and we usually coordinate with the front desk, and we're asking who is here, who is not, just checking the software. And I was suddenly told, stop it, we're not seeing patients. Stop it until further instructions. And that was like a kind of, wow, what's going on? And then in an hour, we were told that that's it. not seeing patients until further instructions. Everybody started to reschedule the patients who were already in the waiting room, and that was kind of shock. And after that, it became more and more shock, and so that was pretty shock, So at that moment,
it was a shock to all of our systems, almost overnight. Tahina, do you remember what happened when you had that moment that you crossed over into the different world?
I remember not quite feeling it quite yet, the fear, and then within a day, I had been out that weekend. My brother-in-law was here, and then the next day, I started to fear about the air, about being out, and I was walking to work because we weren't closed down yet, because I just was afraid on the subways, and from then the world changed. I started working at home. Our hospitals were filling up like crazy, and it was all we could do to try to raise some money to get PPE.
Yes.
And keep everybody safe.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all for sharing that. I have certainly a market date as well. Here I was booked for the whole year in my world. And between March 11th and March 13th, everything was canceled almost overnight. And so we all have experienced this kind of shattering to what we once considered normal. And we share this almost collective trauma. We add to that not only the uncertainty that comes around that, which I'm going to talk and remind you of why that's so challenging for us, but it's also when we add all of the additional unrest that's been happening. But here's what's interesting about what's happening in this particular period of time is that people are starting to learn something about themselves. And so I'd love to see you put in the chat box, what has this experience taught you about yourself? So for me, it taught me that I actually more of an introvert than I even realized. I didn't realize that when I traveled a lot, because I was on the road quite frequently, that I had a lot of downtime in the hotel where I did not have anyone around. It was almost a shock to my system to all of a sudden be around someone for 24 hours a day. So I would be curious to just, if you would, you can either unmute or you can put it in the chat, whatever's convenient. Anyone want to share what they have learned about themselves during this experience? Xiomara, would you mind chiming in? What did you learn about yourself during this experience? She's on mute, so she'll unmute herself. Yes.
I learned that I can multitask even more than what I can normally do. Working from home remotely with my kids, being a parent. So that was very challenging, but I'm getting through it. So
okay,
I think that was.
What I'm finding, if any of you want to be able to put that in there, what I'm finding is that people are learning something new about themselves. And that's been almost an opportunity for us to figure this out. So why is all of this important? Well, it's because we collectively have been catapulted into this particular situation. We've got, I'm sure you've never experienced this yourself in your hospital, but where, someone's saying, I'm sure glad, thank you, Tahina, that we can get through anything. I'm sure glad the hole isn't in our end of the boat. That was actually where my career started, when I understood the importance of seeing the bigger picture, because there are always people who are at the bottom bailing things out. And I'm hearing from my friends and colleagues in healthcare that that's what many of you may feel like, and everybody else is watching. Or people will be feeling like this based on where we are in the country or in the world. So here's the thing that's important for us to remember, is this domino illustration, it has one key message. It's that cause and effect is far removed in space and time. So what happens in our organizations, or even what's happening right now, is that whoever pushes the first domino, it takes a long time before the last domino falls. And usually the people who push those dominoes are gone. Usually they've been promoted, they've moved on. Some of you might be dealing with dominoes that were handed to you from before. But here's what most people do. Most people, when they bring us in or bring me in for coaching or bring me in for a problem that's happening, is they want us to focus on the domino that you see at the red arrow about what's happening right then. When in fact, what I know is that the issue came from a long time ago. from a long time ago. So part of what's happening to all of us right now is that our systems that we're dealing with, and especially those of you in healthcare, is some of these things were percolating before. But what COVID has done is that all of a sudden dominoes are pushed all at the same time. And that's part of the overwhelm that we're feeling, because now we're feeling it not only in healthcare, we're feeling it with our personal, we're feeling it with the economic, we're feeling it with whether it's the things that are happening in government, politics. There is like a whole array of dominoes. And I wanted to share this with you because that's important. Because sometimes as we watch what's happening to our systems over the next few months, is that we miss the warning signs. And the number one question I receive from people is, why did I miss it? Well, we miss it because this is what life looks like most of the time to us. Most of us are dealing with just the domino that's in front of us right then at that moment, and it feels massive at times. And so I started having my illustrationists pull these illustrations together because it was difficult for leaders to understand how these things that they could not see were playing out. And so at any time that you are frustrated with yourself for maybe not seeing something, or why did I not pick up on this, please understand that this is why. This is why it's so challenging, and this is why it's so important for us as leaders to be able to navigate between the trees and then between the forest. So for the first time, I've been talking about this subject for 25 years. And for the first time, I think we're all really have a hands-on understanding of the fact that what affects one does affect all. That within one decision, one moment, one choice, that we actually have the whole world in our hands. And I do believe that that may end up being a positive. All right, didn't know how unprepared we were as a country or city. Very, very good point, Tahina. Thank you very much. I do believe that this understanding is actually going to serve us well in our organizations, surprisingly so, because many, many people did not really have an understanding of this before. So let's talk a little bit about navigating your now, because this is part of what our challenge is. What do I do in this moment to make sure that I am managing myself, I'm handling the emotions, I'm handling the boundaries and the feelings that are happening. So I wanted to introduce you to what we call a mood meter, and I'll show you the book that this comes from. But when I typically ask people, how do you feel today in this moment? So feel free to put that in the chat box. How do you feel? Now, we don't like this F word, feel, so we tend to ignore it. So I put up this chart to give you a little bit of tips about how are you feeling today. That was another version of how I was asking you about where were you on a scale of 1 to 10. So just pick one. You can, if a feeling comes to mind, you can just put it in the chat box. But how are you feeling today at this moment with this webinar, with this learning opportunity for yourself? So for me, I was actually excited about it. But I have to tell you, I've been on Zoom all week long, and there have been a time or two where I was not excited about it, and I was quite tired, and it's been a challenge. So I see hopeful. That's good news. Curious. Okay. The reason I bring this up is because feelings are more important than we've been giving them credit for. And this mood meter has come up there with a permission to feel. You can see the book there. You also can download the app. And I bring this up because, my friends, what's happening is that we've actually been going through life so busy that we don't even acknowledge our feelings anymore. Does anyone relate? We have almost become where we don't pay attention to the feelings. And here's the thing about this issue of feelings is that facts don't change feelings, but our feelings shape the way we interpret every fact that is presented to us, every fact. And so when we keep wanting to put ourselves in boxes where I'm very logical, and so I'm speaking to my healthcare friends because this is a conversation that we have a lot. We get very focused on the logic, and we really don't have time to acknowledge the feelings because we've got a job to do. Well, I have two thoughts for you when we talk about bringing clarity to the chaos that might be in your world. Is one, from the kind of right side of the brain, is that feelings are the language of your soul. So that's a softer side. But what I also want to remind you is that our feelings are just like the equipment you have in your hospitals, where they're like a barometer, a dashboard of your having an indicator, a reading. So I bring this up to you because I know that this issue of burnout is very important in the medical community. I spoke at the AMA conference last year. I've been very active some of these conversations that are happening around this. I do a lot of work with a healthcare consulting group out of Florida called CTI. The issue of burnout, and what happens is that doctors and physicians and our clinicians and our healthcare leadership will blow right past the warning signs. So I bring this up, this issue of feelings up, because if there's one thing that you take away today is please start tuning in to what are you feeling today? Because the more stress we have, the more we shut down, and then we're numb and we miss the warning signs. And this understanding of feelings is something that we do day by day, decision by decision. It literally is a moment by moment thought. And so what this opportunity has done for us, it's also had us think a little bit more about our boundaries, because this is also something that people tend to blur just a bit, is that first is acknowledging that we feel, okay, stopping the spin. So I want to talk about the spin. What happens in any given moment is that we're either going well and things are spinning upward, or we're on a slow slide down and the spinning is going down. What the challenge when I'm working with leaders in this space is the fact that they go past that moment, that instant where they can actually stop the spin. And that's where awareness is the key. So please make a commitment to yourself to begin to ask yourself, what am I feeling? And then also ask yourself, what do I need? Or ask your team, what do you need? These are conversations that I think many of us are starting to have, and we're not very good at articulating it. I mean, it was difficult for me, I'll be honest with you. It was difficult for me to even say to my husband, I love you, I'm really glad we're spending time together, but I gotta tell you, I need a few hours where I'm not speaking. That was hard. And what happens is we end up having fear get in the way of that. So ask yourself what you need and begin to take a step and talk to your team about it. Very, very important. I do want to mention these two words, emotional bandwidth. Very important for us to choose wisely. When we as leaders, so let me talk about this for just a moment. We as leaders have only so much emotional bandwidth and leadership energy at any given day. So I want to show you where sometimes our emotional bandwidth is invested, because we lose sight of the fact that our emotional bandwidth is a precious resource. And here are some ways that I see people, I see leaders sometimes wasting their emotional bandwidth. So first is that what they do is they want to focus on who's to blame. The issue is that many of the things that you're all living with is a systems issue. It's not as simple as who or what is to blame. So it usually sounds like, who did this? Whose fault was this? Find who did this so it doesn't happen again. Well, we spend a lot of our emotional bandwidth there. But we also, to my friends in healthcare and on some of the other industries I've worked in, we also invest a lot of emotional energy looking for a hero. Someone to ride in on the white horse, standing on the bedrock of knowledge with the sword of execution and the shield of strategy. And please understand that is for both men and women. Men and women. And so the reason I'm bringing this up to all of you, okay, and I'd like to just stop for a moment, is that when you think about how exhausted you are from a day, let me make sure here. When you think about how exhausted you are at some of the shifts that you're doing, do you ever see these two things playing out? Looking for someone to either blame, even if it's not spoken out loud, or looking for someone to be a hero, or maybe even asking yourself to be the hero. Anybody want to share? You're all telling me that you're already exhausted today. I better just keep pouring into you. All right, I get it. I get it. What I find is that, all right, I see absolutely. Okay, I see the issue.
Yeah.
Great.
I'd like to make a comment.
Please.
I think last week we had a webinar, I Don't Feel Like a Hero. And I think society put a lot of their hope and fears into our frontline workers,
Yes.
the heroes to save the day, and maybe even a way to like not have to take any responsibility themselves. You know, and the poor heroes at the beginning of this didn't have enough PPE, didn't have the resources they needed.
Yes.
Yet we were still putting everybody on this pedestal. probably so the rest of us didn't have to take responsibility. And I feel that that's something that happens a lot.
There's actually a lot of wisdom in that, Johannes. So we could have a whole nother webinar about that particular issue, but that is something that happens with the healthcare. Each system that I work with has a personality of its own. And one of the downsides of what's happened over history with healthcare is the fact that many do keep placing the responsibility on all of you. And in fact, it is many of ours. We could do a whole session about that, but thank you very much for sharing that. The reason I'm bringing all of this up is because we each have to make choices. We can make choices about where we invest our energies. And here's the other suggestion I wanted to give to you, is there's a lot of drama that's happening right now. And when it comes to our emotional bandwidth, that drama plus the hero plus the blame issue really begins to eat it up. And there's not a sign that it's going to slow down anytime soon. So please be mindful. I want you to almost think about your leadership energy being like a glass each day, and making conscious choices about what are you going to pour it into? Where are you going to invest? Because it's absolutely critical. Because here's what happens. Is that every industry has a narrative, a set of belief systems that actually flow with them and through them. And I've come to call that the narrative. And what happens in that industry is the fact that everybody else that they're talking to and making decisions with, they're also in what I call the fishbowl. And so I've spent a lifetime of actually plucking people out of the fishbowl. It's very difficult to see that you have choices when you're in the fishbowl. And the reason I show this to you is for you to begin to ask yourselves, when could we possibly make different choices? Because here's the challenge about what so many of us are going through at the moment, and what many of you as leaders are having the pressure of having to make some decisions, is that there's no playbook for this. There's no playbook for what's happening right now. And what's happening is that we each are having to maybe look in the mirror a little bit more and wonder if maybe that answer is inside. And we've been taught actually not to be able to count on those own instincts. That's part of why we've ignored the feelings. And that's what I want to bring to light here today. So as we keep moving here, I want to talk about this resilience on the rise. I know that you all know about how the body works, but I find that sometimes in healthcare, you often forget why you have felt uncomfortable. So just a quick reminder. I'm actually on the faculty of Microsoft, where I've been working with them on a major transformation initiative for thousands of their leaders. And there's a big reminder about this issue of the brain not liking uncertainty. And that's part of what we're all dealing with. So please remember that the brain would rather have bad news than no news. So if you have been frustrated with yourself at any moment about why you're feeling anxious, this is part of what's going on. We'd almost rather have the news to say, this is going to be how long this happens. We're not going to, change things until this date and then go on. But the issue of no news, or at least no decision around news, makes our brains anxious. And you all know this, but I just want to remind you for yourself personally, because the healthcare leaders that I work with, you all are pouring and pouring and pouring into other people. And you don't have as many people pouring into you. So I want to do that right now and just remind you that our bodies are not designed for this extended period of stress. I mean, our bodies were designed to only be able to respond to a short-term kind of issue. And yet here we are. We're becoming weary. We're worn out because we're not designed for this. And we're constantly in this high alert mode. And that's adding a great deal of stress here. And we're going to talk about this issue of self-care. So I know you all know the human body. I'm not going to go a great deal into that there, but self-care is essential to regulate our systems. And I know of all the industries that I work with, self-care and healthcare is the most challenging. I want to remind you is that our brains are actually 5 times more wired for fear than any other emotion. Think about that for a minute. 5 times more wired for fear than any other emotion. And so think about the toll that that's taking on us. Our brains are looking, and right now we have plenty of reasons to want to tap into that fear. And it takes conscious intent to be able to shift that perspective. Now, here's something really important that I'd like to have mention to all of you is I know that many leaders like to have control. If I had you all day and I was doing a session with you, I could actually map out and show you how the system works and remind you that control always was an illusion, my friends, my new friends here today. Control always was an illusion. And I know some of you are not going to like that. You're welcome to fess that up in the chat box if you'd like, because I find that people in leadership positions, we've been trained to think that we're in control. And here we all have come face to face with a reality that there's not as much control. And it's an uncomfortable place for us. So that's a challenge. Now, I do want to remind you of this. I want to recommend this book. How many of you might be addicted to your phone? I'm just curious, meaning that you rarely ever lay it to the side. When do you turn it off? So I'm curious, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being, yes, I really don't, it's not a big deal. I don't have to have my phone with me. And 10 being, I practically start to hyperventilate it when I don't have it with me. So where are you? 3, nice, okay. This is important because one of the things, and I want you really to think about this and even think about your families or the others that you interact with. This issue, nice, you all are lower than many. What I like about this particular book is it's a small book. They know that people who are addicted to their phones, I do have a 9, a 2. I do find that it tends to go on generational ages as well. But what the book does is it explains to us why we're addicted. It's all about that dopamine release. But here's why this is important, is that not only do we have this issue of the phone, okay, so we have 24-hour connection, we also have the issue of media. I want you to think back to a crisis that we've had of this magnitude in the world, where in addition to the crisis, we have also had the assault of 24 hours access to news and information. Please don't blow past the significance of this. This is vitally important. Part of why we all are even feeling more weary is because we have this continuous assault. And right now, the only person who can regulate that is ourselves. And so I'm just curious, does anybody remember, I know I may have at least 1 or 2 on here, does anybody remember what life was like before we had all this technology? Back in the days before we had emails and before technology was a part of our everyday world. What was life like? Khurshid, would you like to share? I'd love to hear from some of you. What was life like back then? Because I think it's important for some of ours to hear what that was like. Anybody want to unmute?
So that was pretty interesting. I remember it very nicely because probably because the man spending more life outside than ladies, than women, and we are more social. So without all these phones, we spend more time with the friends. We spend more time to get some kind of information from the people we know, speak to each other in person rather than sitting in homes and using all the gadgets. I mean, so to make it shorter, the life was much more real than virtual, what we are seeing and observing now. So that was a more human relations than like virtual relations when you may be anybody, you may like hide your face, you may be absolutely like unknown, anonymous, and so that's give you a lot of chances to be bad or good person in life. It's like a very obvious, so you cannot play too much like you may play when you're virtual. So that's the biggest difference between then and now.
Well, and I'm seeing some of the answers. Easier, less stressful, more real, more present in the moment, and more simple. Less efficient, but more simple. All right, those are all really good answers. Well, it's important for us to talk to our kids and even the younger leaders in our worlds and our teams, because there's now a whole generation or 2 that have no idea that it's possible not to have that technology. And they don't even understand the importance of being able to unplug from it. So I wanted to bring that up because we have never, as society, dealt with this all at the same time. And so my thought is, and concern is back to that domino illustration, cause and effect is far removed in space and time, is if we are not careful about dialing back from the use of technology, I myself, I had broken up with my phone 2 years ago. I did well, and I am now having to literally put myself into having a harder time because that fear issue begins to come up. So it's really, really critical. And that ties into this issue of self-care. So self-care is no longer optional. And I wanted to mention just a few things. I know this is an ongoing issue and it's difficult for all of you in healthcare. I hear about it frequently at all levels of leadership. I want to mention to you just a few things that you can take care of today. One is please remember the importance of the deep breathing. Many of us have become shallow breathers. We forget to slow down, even if it's the fact that we take 3 long, slow, deep breaths before we go into a room. Long, 3 slow, deep breaths, simply to be able to have our bodies begin to slow down. The sleep, you all know the importance. Here, I wanted to remind you all of the water issue. We know water is important. We've heard that a lot, but here's why. It's because water is flushing out the chemicals that's actually happening with all this extra stress. So I just wanted to remind you of a couple of these things. And I would like to bring some attention to that gratitude audit. I went through a very challenging time in my life back in 2008 when I lost everything personally and professionally. And that was during the time of the economic crash. And I remember how challenging it was to be able to even just make it through the day. And we have a lot of people that are facing those kinds of situations. I share this with you because one of the only ways that I was able to get through that difficult time was to have this gratitude audit, even for the simplest of things. Now, I'm going to ask you what you're grateful for, but I don't want you to gravitate towards the obvious. We tend to say family, friends, living where we live. It's the simplest of things that happen. I became grateful for the fact that I could see and I could hear. I became grateful that I could walk unassisted. I became grateful that I could take a shower and be able to care for myself. I became grateful for the fact that I had access to running water. So please take just a minute to think through what is something that you are grateful for that you haven't thought about in a while. Because what happens, especially in a crisis and these kinds of times, is that gratitude will go a long way, not only from a neuroscience perspective, but also from an emotional perspective. So I'd love to see that in the chat box as I'm continuing. What are you grateful for? What do we maybe have taken for granted that we'd like to bring grateful for? And just be thinking about that. Health, isn't that the truth? I learned, we've all been reminded that health is an asset. Good health, good job. Absolutely. So as you leave here today, begin to think about some of the small things, because the only way we are actually going to be able to make it through all of this is to actually begin to think through some of those small things. And so begin to listen to what people are saying. People have a very difficult time of acknowledging this issue of feelings and then actually being able to do something about it. This is part of why I want to offer you a tool today. This is a very simple tool. It was started actually in the aviation industry, and it's called the check-in. And you ask 3 questions. And sometimes you can have people pair up. You could just do it one-on-one. You can ask the question, what do you feel? Okay, and feeling is usually 1 word. You can ask, what is distracting you right now? I'll explain more. And then you can add a 3rd question if you'd like. What we're finding, and this is what I'm watching some other organizations do, is that this doesn't take long. It only takes, you can do 2 or 3 minutes, and you would be surprised at how it begins to help you at least have an escape hatch to be able to understand this. Now, this issue of distraction, we all know that the whole world is distraction, but some of us are dealing with different things. I know for me, earlier in the time, my 104-year-old mother-in-law was in a nursing home. It was very distracting, of course, not being able to see her, as I know many of you have experienced. That was a different level of stress. But then we lost her 3 weeks in, and not being able to have a proper burial for my Italian mother-in-law that had been talking about the way it should be. Those particular days, that was difficult. How do I help my husband grieve? So when you ask about what is distracting you, you're giving people a small escape hatch to have some humanity and being able to deal with this issue of the feelings. It takes courage, but I've seen it make a very big difference when it comes to psychological safety. Who knew that a simple tool like a check-in could make such a difference? Now, a couple of other things as we're in our last time here together is that we are at this issue of a crossroads of a choice point. And we're dealing, especially as leaders, is that there's no playbook for this. I'm watching even my daughter, who started her first job out of college. She literally just moved away, 6 hours away, to Richmond, started her first job the end of January. 5 weeks later, her first job out of college, 5 weeks later, she's catapulted into having to go home. And I find a lot of our employees are looking to leaders for the answer. And what I've reminded her is that there really is no answer yet, because there's no playbook for this. So please be careful of how much pressure you put on yourself around this, because we're all dealing with that same thing. What's also a challenge for us, and what I believe will be an opportunity, if we can begin to see it like that, is many of the systems, as the comment you mentioned earlier about the issues around the city or the county, many of our systems were already unsteady. We've been sent warning signs for a very long time, but we've all been too busy, focused on the very big domino, and we haven't been able to see it. So just don't be surprised as we're watching this. Listen in as you do tune in to whether it's newspapers or the news. When you do that little, how many times you're beginning to hear this word systems, because it offers a learning opportunity for us all. And the last point I wanted to make to you is I find that many of my leaders in healthcare almost sometimes begin to think they're invincible. I want to remind you that there is a limit to how much change any system can tolerate. And that includes you. That includes you. All of these things that I'm bringing up today are because I'm talking with leaders at so many levels. I had a leader the other day that had to lay off 70% of their large brand name company. I've had leaders that are having to manage, how do you begin to bring people back? Please respect the fact that we are all dealing with more change than we ever have in the past, and honor yourself. Be mindful of that issue of emotional bandwidth, because we're all going to be reaching it at a different level than we have before. But we can connect the dots to all of this. So there are some things, some positives that are coming out of this that I'm watching already. And so I want to remind you that despite what happens, there is hope on the horizon. What I'm finding is that we're all becoming much more aware of the lens that we wear. So I talk a lot about mental models, okay? Mental models are the belief systems we have. They're the lens through which we see the world. They're not right or wrong, but what's dangerous is when we don't realize that we actually have them on. That's what's dangerous. I've spent a lifetime of helping people figure out what lens they're really looking for, because that colors everything else that they have. And so as we all as leaders are leading people through this situation, it's very important that we think about where we're focusing and where our team is focusing. And I know that's been a real challenge. I'd like to remind you of the importance of words. Words have power. I find that when people are using words like I have to, I should, I must, it is an indicator of someone somewhere deep inside feeling powerless. Please start to pay attention to those words, even if it's your own language, and we can change that to I can, I choose to, I would like to. So this issue of powerlessness begins to almost like a back entrance where our energy begins to seep out of it, and understand that our words are an indicator of that. I also want to remind you of this, is that balance is the key to all things. All systems have a life of their own. And most systems, if you look at the left, the perfectly balanced system has a balance between stability and flexibility. And this comes from the book that I have there in the upper right, and also in the PDF that will be sent to you after this webinar. What happens though is those of us who want to control the system, which is most of our instincts, is we've stacked our systems with so much stability that it no longer can move. And this is what we're part of what we're dealing with, is that we're not as nimble whenever there's a huge change. And so I actually encourage leaders to begin to say, every time you add on something, okay, for stability, you figure out what you can take off. I know this is especially difficult for all of you in healthcare, and I know you feel this issue of the stability overwhelming you. What I also want to point out is one of my biggest concerns right now is that we have, in a perfect world, tech has a great, it's terrific for us as CMR, as we were talking about earlier. It's great that we have the tech, as long as we have the wisdom that we balance with it. But I am watching us slowly begin to shift where we are weighing down the tech side of things so much that our systems personally and professionally are going to start going out of sync, and there's going to be a host of unintended consequences down the line. So I bring this up because I'm going to tie this into you personally as well, is that real living systems, okay, healthcare, education, government, real living systems survive in the middle of two extremes. And it is a little bit on the edge of chaos, which, by the way, you all understand better than any other industry that I've worked with. But that edge of chaos actually also is the optimum condition for you to be adaptable. So let's flip this a little bit and talk about you personally. What needs more balance in your life today? So when we're talking about bringing clarity to chaos, I'd like you to think about this. Because instead of thinking about the healthcare system or the hospital that you're at or the system that you're in, I want you to see yourself as a system. Where do you need more balance? And so is it possible that you need more balance between moving fast in life and moving slow? Is it possible about having more balance between the head and the heart? Is it personal of managing having a personal life and a professional life? Short term, long term? Is it work, self-care? So I'd love you to think about that for just a minute. I'm going to give you just a few seconds to think about that and enter that into the chat box. Unless you want to come off mute, I'd be glad to hear from you. But what is out of balance right now, even in your own world? What is out of balance that you could benefit from seeing maybe a little bit differently? Short and long term. For me, it was a balance of providing and supporting everybody else's needs and also supporting my own needs. That was a challenge. Personal and professional, yes. This issue of balance is something that we don't do very well as humanity, and I am genuinely hoping that that will be one of the positive unintended consequences that come out of this situation. And so even if you don't have an answer today, please ask yourself this weekend, what needs more balance in your life? Because here's what's happening, my friends, is that you and I right now, we've got one foot in the past of what we knew as a society and as our healthcare and the way the world used to be. And now we have one foot in the future with the unknown that we're not sure how it's going to happen. And we're straddling the present. And we're feeling that pull. We're feeling that pull. And as we go forward, there's decisions that are going to be made. And so just a couple of thoughts here. What is ahead? Well, I genuinely believe that the load that systems are carrying are going to be shifted. We're going to watch that. We're going to finally feel the things that we had not been paying attention to and ask ourselves, how do we handle it and how do we shift that? And one of the biggest benefits I see, and this is where I want to offer you some hope, is that part of what happens to us is that we get very, very focused on the answer, capital T, capital H, capital E. Either this is the answer or this is the answer, and we want to cling to one of the answers. But now we're moving into this both and. So before, are we closed or are we open? Are we living with COVID or not living with COVID? So this is part of the shift, and there are so many systems and so many leaders that would really benefit from shifting from an either or. It either has to be this way or this way, to both and. Because I want you to think about it, even if you think about breathing, you inhale, exhale, what's more important? We would all agree that both are important. But how many of us in our organizations are having discussions and battles and spending a lot of our emotional bandwidth debating what is more important? So listen for the conversations that are happening. And when you hear the word but or yes, but, it's an indicator that people are in that either or kind of mentality. And perhaps you could provide a nudge in asking clarifying questions to move them to both and. And I do also believe that there is going to be a renewed appreciation for what I call upstream leadership. And I wanted to make a recommendation for you of this book. We are actually, this is an opportunity for all of us for the first time, understanding this issue of the domino illustration. Cause and effect far removed in space and time. And so I know for many of you that you also felt that, in your own world. So I know that in March, all of a sudden I had to stay home. So I planned a knee surgery. I'm all set come May, it was like May something, ready to have my knee replacement surgery. And then 2 days before I went in, after I already had my pre-op, everything came to a screeching halt, because we all felt the effects right then of decisions that were made about equipment from a long time ago. And so what I think is going to be the opportunity for all of us in these industries is to have a better understanding of the fact that that cause and effect has a time lag. Where the rest of the world is not as instant as we would like to think it is on our laptops or even on our phones. So I do believe that we'll be seeing a lot of that. So maybe start having the conversations with your folks just to have a look at that. And also understand, I do believe we've heard about emotional intelligence. We've heard all kinds of things about intelligence. I genuinely believe that one of the #1 skills in this next 5 to 10 years is going to be systemic intelligence. This issue of understanding how the parts connect, what happens between the two, seeing the forest and the trees. We have for a long time invested our time and not looking at the systems. And I'd like to encourage you, and I'm the resource that I'm sending you all, that your team will send you. I've given you several resources, and I would love to encourage you to please become much more of a systems thinker and understanding the systems intelligence. You already understand it more than any other industry other than aviation, but more than any other industry, you actually understand systems at a biological medical level. You have the ability, I believe, to be able to influence others by taking this from a micro level to a macro level. And what I believe is going to happen, I'm already watching this happening, is that I actually see the seeds of innovation being planted right now. I believe that despite how challenging it is at the moment, we are going to see the seeds of innovation being planted right now that is going to bloom. And what we're all kind of going through together is like a global reboot. How many of us actually, when our phones aren't working, we go to reboot it. Our computer's not working, we go to reboot it because we need a shakeup. And that's what's happening here. And so as we wrap up here today, because I understand how precious your time is, I do want to remind you of a new field of science that's coming out with more and more information. And this is information from the HeartMath Institute, where they're showing more about the importance of not only understanding this beauty of our brain, okay? The brain, I have my anatomically correct brain here, that the brain is important, but also understanding the importance of the heart and the intelligence that comes from it. And while we've had an entire leadership direction of only making decisions with our head, I believe that we're now entering, because of the circumstances, that we're going to be balancing the head and the heart. And so you might want to check out the HeartMath Institute, some fascinating research coming through. And so you will receive this actual PDF. What I did is I summarized just the high points so you could have it on a one page. I'm all about simplicity. But on the bottom right, I did give you some resources. It is my passion that I think we could all bring more clarity to chaos once we understand things from a systems perspective. And so please understand, most importantly, is that you're not alone. You're not alone in this, and you're not alone about how you feel, and you're not alone about where you are. And a reminder of, I really do believe that these 3 things are going to be what helps us move forward and harness. It is my genuine hope that this may be the beginning of our journey and not the end. I know that not all of you may or may not be on LinkedIn. You're certainly welcome to find me on LinkedIn or Twitter. But I wanted to simply invest in you today, and I appreciated having the opportunity from Tuhina and from Ziamara to have this opportunity to invest in all of you. I appreciate you, and I appreciate the work that you're doing. And so I will hand it back over to Tuhina or answer any other questions we have before we show our last few slides.
I thank you so much, Kim, for putting some perspective on what's going on. And like we usually feel like we need to blame ourselves for things, but it is a series of systems and problems in the systems
It is.
ultimately might fall apart. So I agree with you. The systems thinking, including with the racial justice pieces going on right now, is really important because we can't do anything in isolation.
We can. And one of the most important questions that we'll be asking ourselves as we move forward, Johannes, is it the system or is it me? Is it the system or is it me? And not placing all of the blame on ourselves, and understanding that that system has a life of its own. It's a living, breathing entity that is sitting in the room with you and your team as you're making decisions.
Any questions for Kim? She's also available afterwards. You can email her.
I am.
Okay. Next slide.
Absolutely.
Okay, I'm putting the CME slide back up. So please make a note of it.
I see a question about the one pager. It is going to be emailed from your team that organized this along with the surveys. So you'll have that one pager that has the details. I always want to make sure that people have resources. You're most welcome. And thank you for the kind words. I would say the same to all of you.
Next page.
Yes.
Okay, so from all of us, Pagney Health and Research Foundation, thank you for joining us. We will have more programs, hopefully weekly, for you to join. I also want to thank everybody for the donations and gifts that they've been putting into the Pagney Health and Research Foundation. We've raised $268,000 so far and counting, and we're able to bring you programs like this and purchase PPE and try to make your lives a little better.
And Black Sheep also made a donation as
Yes.
thankful
Yeah.
and appreciation for all of you as well.
Thank you for that to Black Sheep for a very generous donation.
And as we all finish up here, just remember, hope. It begins with hope and it ends with hope. I want to thank you all very much. There is a question, as there's a recording of this webinar. Yes, and Tahina, is there one from the previous sessions recordings?
Yes, there are. We're getting them all up online very shortly. It usually takes about a week or so to get them up.
Okay. All right. Everyone take care. We were on time, and have a good weekend.
Thank you so much, Kim. Have a wonderful weekend.
You too.
Everybody have a great weekend. Bye. Be well, be safe.